Welcome to the Greenspan Floortime approach. Here we will discuss the concepts of neurodivergence and neuropotential. Both of these terms are key to understanding human development, especially for individuals with diagnoses like ASD, ADHD, and OCD. Neurodivergence is a societal construct that helps us understand and respect the many different ways people think and process information. It highlights the idea that there is no single normal brain. NeuroPotential, on the other hand, is a scientific and biological concept. It refers to the brain's incredible ability to grow and develop throughout a person's life, regardless of their diagnosis. Essentially, every person's nervous system is capable of learning and changing. While some believe that these two principles are in conflict, at the Greenspan Floortime approach, we see them as complementary concepts that can coexist and support one another. All of us have variations in our brain's function and how we learn and process information, which makes all of us neurodivergent from one another. However, individuals with the diagnoses may have more significant and observable neurodivergent tendencies that make their neurodivergence more noticeable. And the real question is not how do we identify someone's neurodivergence, but instead how do we respect each other's neurodivergence? How do we create a world that is set up to support individuals in their unique learning styles, as well as make sure that the environments that we're in are conducive to growth and supporting health. And this gets us to our next concept of neuropotential. Every single living human being on this planet has the potential to grow and change through our lives. And we don't just do this physically, but we do this neurologically, meaning that our brains, our cognitive abilities, even our personalities, none of these things are fully static. Whether we're aware of it or not, every day, the experiences we have, the environments we're in, are causing changes to the way in which we actually experience and understand the world. These changes may be small and take place over long periods of time, or they may be significant and happen rapidly, like in the cases of trauma. And while it might be a little scary to think that the world around us is causing us to change without us knowing it, we actually do know what some of the most important variables are that cause these changes, i.e. what types of environments are going to be supportive and inducing healthy growth versus what types of experiences and environments may actually create more maladaptive growth. For example, if children are spending time in different environments, we want to make sure what they're learning are things that are moving them forward in terms of their social emotional health. For example, let's say a young child can be very warm, connected, interactive, and playful in an environment with 1, 2, maybe even 3 other people in it. However, when that same child goes into a room with 10, 15, 20 kids where it's loud and chaotic, instead of being connected, warm, and playful, they withdraw, become overwhelmed, and play in the corner by themselves. Even if they're playing appropriately by themselves, think about what they're learning from that experience. Or they're learning that this space is overwhelming, the way to protect myself is to isolate, and then I can keep myself happy and occupied by playing with these toys in the corner by myself. Is that really a lesson we want a child to be learning in one of their first school experiences? Well, this is where environment matters. And yes, while children do need to go to school for learning and social purposes, we want to make sure it's the right time, and we want to make sure they actually can benefit from being in school, which requires them being able to tolerate the environment as well as stay engaged and connected within the different social experiences. But this takes us to a bigger picture question that I've heard from a number of caregivers and when we're talking about these concepts. When I bring up the example of going into a classroom with 10, 15, 20 kids and a child withdrawing or shutting down or self-isolating, whereas when we're in our office, which is a much more controlled environment where there might only be 2 or 3 people in a room at any given time, where the child can be very engaged, interactive, and warm and connected. The parent says, but maybe that's just who my child is. They're never going to be a very social person. And I agree with them. No one should ever force a child to be social. However, having choice is a very powerful tool set that every one of us deserves to develop. So if that child is impulsively reacting to their environment, to gravitate towards the corner to isolate themselves. That's very different than them choosing not to play with a friend, not to go to a party, or not to be in that social environment. And the only way a child is going to get to the point where they're actually making a cognitive decision, a real choice, is to first develop the tools that would allow them to engage and interact socially with a peer or an adult. And the one thing we know from years and years of research is that every human being benefits from engaging in meaningful relationships, regardless of diagnosis. So if relationships are essential to our overall health and even cognitive abilities, then how can we make sure that experiences that lead to these meaningful relationships are being prioritized over simply putting a child in a classroom because that's where they're supposed to be? Additionally, if I know that a child does better in a small, supportive, less stimulating environment, and I encourage the school or the family to put them there, is that respecting their neurodivergence? Because we as the adults in their lives have identified that these are areas for growth. Well, the short answer is yes. I believe that is the fundamental definition of respecting neurodivergence, is creating a world that supports all types of individuals and their processing styles, especially a world that's nurturing their growth as well as limiting overstimulation and stress. And while most neurodiversity advocates will tell you their primary goal is to reduce the stress and create a world that's more hospitable for individuals with neurodivergent profiles, we believe it's also important to make sure those aren't just void of the stressors, but also are incorporating opportunities for growth. While other versions of my father's work, i.e. non-Greenspan Floortime versions of Floortime, promote the idea that we need to support children by reducing the stress and stimulation in their environments and giving them opportunities to seek out experiences that will calm themselves. And I put calm in quotation marks because not all calming is the same as regulation. If we are calming ourselves in a repetitive, isolated, self-involved manner that's more rigid and habitual, that's actually just calming ourselves, but that is not true regulation. However, with Greenspan DIR and Greenspan Floortime, we're not just looking at reducing the stress and the stimulation, we're actually trying to create more opportunities for growth and developing relationships, as well as getting into co-regulated interactions which lead to longer-term regulation, adaptability, flexibility, communication, problem solving, etc. Another facet of Greenspan Floortime that is critical to supporting your child's growth and development is that it is a strength-based intervention. This means that instead of focusing on an adult identifiable goal that we want to address within a child because we can check it off a list, we are looking at how to nurture a child from the ground up. But most importantly, by using the Greenspan DIR model, which uses the concept of milestones, which shows a progression in different skill sets that we learn over time, we can identify and support and nurture a child's growth through those milestones in a natural manner. So instead of saying we need to teach them or work on X, Y, or Z, we're actually helping them grow naturally without specifically addressing individual goals. In doing so, we're addressing what we consider true strengths, which are developmental strengths, starting from the ground up. However, other versions of Floortime, non-Greenspan Floortimes, tend to address what we call splinter strengths, which are not developmental strengths, but these are strengths that emerge as splinter skills, things that don't necessarily follow a developmental trajectory. So a child, for example, who's a great sight reader, right? They're good with memory and visual processing, so they can memorize words and how to pronounce them. But let's say their understanding of the meaning of those words isn't there. So their comprehension of the words is very different than their ability to actually read them and say the word. In these other frameworks, they would continue to teach children to memorize words and just explore sight reading and hopefully get them into understanding more of the comprehension of those words. Whereas with the Greenspan Floortime approach, we would actually go back and say, okay, this child can decode symbols, but their meaningful connection with those ideas is not fully there. So we need to go back and help them connect meaning to the symbols. But we're not going to do that just in reading. We need to be doing this holistically. We need to be doing this in play. We need to be doing this in more meaningful, co-regulated interactions around their primary interest, which might involve reading, but also hopefully will involve a lot of other mediums. So as you can see in the trunk of this tree, these are Dr. Greenspan's 6 fundamental social-emotional developmental milestones. These are our guide for all individuals. For example, when a child is progressing into simple back and forth exchanges in the first few months of life, these exchanges begin as reciprocal gestures. So a look for a look, a smile for a smile, even a sound for a sound at times, right? This is when the caregiver looks over into the baby's crib and gets a smile. This is where it begins. But after a child begins to understand cause and effect through these very simple exchanges of a smile for a smile, if mommy smiles at me and I smile back at her, I get a kiss or a hug or something else. These types of exchanges are the foundation for all other social patterns and interactions. But these 1, 2, 3 step back and forth exchanges are just the beginning. As a child gets older, and truly as they practice these simple exchanges, by around 9 months, a child should not just be responding within them, but consistently initiating them as well. Meaning they're reaching out to you to get into little games of peekaboo and get your attention and do other activities. And as they start to see that different gestures and sounds and movements yield different responses from you, all of a sudden they start developing problem solving. I make a noise, mommy comes running. I do this, mommy looks at me with a different. And as we become a more complex problem solver, we're not just using 1 or 2 steps to solve a problem, but what happens when we run into a problem that's more complicated? When our first attempt doesn't work, do we give up? Do we try the same thing over and over? No, we are adaptive. We are problem solvers. Because what is a good problem solver? Someone who keeps trying. Someone who tries different solutions until they come up with the right one. So all of a sudden, you can see how we're moving from basic reciprocity and responsiveness to initiation, to problem solving, to even a continuous interaction requiring many more steps of interactive problem solving and gestures and communication. These are not capacities and milestones that we have to teach a child, but they are something that every single child has the ability to learn and the potential to master. However, a child is only going to master these things if we work from the ground up. It would be like saying, my child is not great at algebra, and my first question to them is, well, how are they at arithmetic? Right? My child's not great at running. Well, are they walking yet? Everything has a precursor. Everything is part of a developmental process when you look at these skill sets. So if we can identify what the trajectory is that a child should be moving along, all of a sudden, we can support a child from the ground up without addressing any specific skills or adult identifiable goals, but still operating within a strength-based framework while respecting that child's neurodiversity. Only Dr. Greenspan's version of his framework, the Greenspan DR model and Greenspan Floortime, uses the term milestones. Other forms of his work use the term capacities and even some other words they've made up. And while capacities is not the incorrect word, in all of his books, he used the terms levels, stages, milestones, and capacities to describe his 6 fundamental developmental social-emotional milestones. But the use of the term milestones is key here, especially within a strength-based framework, because milestones imply progressive sequential growth. Capacities does not. So as we're thinking about a child progressing and moving from one stage or one level to the next, it's necessary to understand how we move from one stage to the next naturally, how it happens for all of us, and how we can move from being just basically interactive to more and how we can move from simple interactions to more complex interactions, to using more language to communicate, to even thinking and expressing ourselves emotionally and logically, right? As we move up these stages, as we move up these milestones, there is a definitive progression that needs to be identified in order to help us learn how we're going to encourage and support that growth. Last year, I was giving a lecture to a group of parents and professionals about the fact that Greenspan Floortime is a strength-based intervention, and really what that means, about how within a strength-based intervention, we're working from the ground up, and we're not simply just addressing splinter skills or trying to pull a child up to age-expected goals. And a mother said to me, well, what if your child just can't do certain things? And I said, like what? And she said, well, when my daughter was 6 years old, a speech and language pathologist tried to teach her sign language, but she couldn't learn sign language. And I said, okay, well, how is she doing now? She said, well, she's 15 years old. She still doesn't know sign language. She doesn't communicate at all and gets very frustrated and reactive because she can't communicate. And the mom continued to go on and say, yeah, she's just not meant to be communicating. That's who she is. And I said, that's possible, but it's also maybe not entirely true. The reasoning is that communication is a developmental process. We don't just start with language. We don't just start with symbolic communication, which sign language is a form of. We actually grow into the capacities for higher levels of communication. But we do this by mastering earlier stages of communication first. I used the analogy earlier, you can't run before you learn to walk. Also, it would be almost impossible to do something like algebra in math if you don't have basic arithmetic, like adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying. Well, the same is true for using sign language, using AACs, or using language, which are all symbolic forms of communication. And what happens is, as we go through the first 18 months of life, children are using their motor systems to communicate. They're looking, they're smiling, they're nodding, they're shaking, they're reaching, they're pushing, they're pulling. They're using complex movement patterns within a social context to get needs met, to play, and to connect with others. Well, just because a child is 5 or 6 doesn't mean they've mastered those previous developmental stages. Just like a child who's 12 or 13 should be ready for algebra, it doesn't mean they are ready for algebra. So unfortunately, what actually this parent didn't want to hear, which is what I said, was that actually, until we go back and fill in these holes, we never know what she's capable of at these higher levels. But now we have a teenager, and going back and working on pre-verbal, pre-linguistic communication with looks and smiles and nods and pushes and pulls, and getting into long patterns of gestural communication, using and mastering our motor system in adaptive, coordinated patterns, are all aspects of necessary precursor capacities that children must master in order to move high enough in their social emotional development to get into symbolic thought and symbolic representations in order to successfully and adaptively use things like sign language, AACs, or language. And so that begs the question. Number one, was that SLP working with the child from the ground up? The answer is no. Just because we have a 5 or 6-year-old doesn't mean they're ready for symbolic communication. It means they might be someday if we respect their neurodiversity and work with them in a strength-based framework from the ground up. But also, we need to look at what types of environments was that child being put in. Was she being nurtured within her social relationships where she could connect and interact and truly understand social reciprocity and cause and effect at a very simple and basic level so that that could naturally expand into more complex interactions? Well, I don't have all the historical information, but I'm guessing since she didn't master those skills, it wasn't readily accessible. And while not every parent has the ability to challenge a school and ask these questions as to whether their child is in the right environment, it's important we as a group, as a society, as a culture, start making sure that these questions are acceptable and questions that get answers. There are a number of scientific studies that look at what it truly means to build a supportive environment for a child and how those environments may be different depending on the child. But the one thing that rings true across all of the research that I've read is that when a child cannot just tolerate an environment, but actually thrive in the environment because they're able to stay socially engaged and interactive while experiencing what that environment has to offer, we see that children learn more from those experiences in those environments than they do when they're in an environment by themselves. Additionally, environments that are meant to be calming children or experiences that are calming for children may not always actually be regulating in the true sense. True regulation is when we are calm while experiencing the world around us, not shutting it out. And experiencing the world around us means being engaged and interactive with people around us. Now, I've never met a child, including children with severe ASD, who are not capable of engaging and interacting at some level. Every single child and adult I've ever met is capable of doing that. The question is, how and in what environment and what supports are present and what things are absent that might be overstimulating. And if we figure out what those details are for each child, we can encourage growth by creating healthy environments for them. But we all need to be on the same page about how we're encouraging health and what health is. Well, one of the first facets of health is the ability to self-regulate, to be calming ourselves and regulating ourselves. But guess where self-regulation comes from? It comes from co-regulation. So actually, we can never learn to fully self-regulate ourselves. We can learn to self-soothe and calm, but that's not self-regulate. As I said, because self-regulating means we're calming ourselves while processing and tolerating social engagement and interaction. But if we have co-regulated interactions and we're learning to self-regulate ourselves, we then can stay engaged and receive compassion and sympathy and empathy from other people, which takes our ability to regulate even further into the future as our lives become more complicated. And one of the environmental factors we have to be aware of in order to encourage this is what children are doing, where they're going, how they are experiencing that calming versus that regulation. If a child needs to go into a dark space, there's no problem with that. They should be able to go into a dark space. But the question is, do they go by themselves, or does someone follow them or sit near them or sit by the door and try to stay connected with them? Because if it is a person they have a nurturing relationship with, like a caregiver, and we've done this dozens and dozens of times over, the child actually wants that caregiver to be present most of the time. And if they can't have them directly next to them or involved with them, usually they're very happy to have them nearby. But think about what happens neurologically as a child is experiencing that calming experience. They go into a dark room. The dark room is void of all the sensory stimulus that aggravated them. Great, they're learning to calm off of the absence of stimulation. Well, what's going to happen when they get back into stimulation? Well, they're no longer going to be calm again. However, what happens if they go into the dark room to shut down the stimulation, but one of their caregivers goes with them? Now, the dark absence of stimulation is part of the calming process, but so is the person. Well, think about which of those tools is going to be longitudinally effective. Which tool do we use as adults to calm ourselves most? Is it getting feedback from other people and possibly having empathy or sympathy given to us? Or is it isolating ourselves and shutting people out? The reality here is that we have to understand that there is a blend of nature and nurture, an interplay, an interaction between the two that drives almost all human development. And over the last 5 years, with improvements in brain imaging, we've been seeing from neuroscience the actual effect that different experiences have on the brain and how the brain grows and develops into its most healthy version of itself. And while different types of physical experiences are very important and can derail or encourage development, what's most important are the emotional and the social experience a child has through co-regulated interactions early in life, or possibly later in life if they weren't able to have them or learn from them early in life. This means that you could have all the self-regulating toys in the world, like fidget spinners and therapy balls to sit on, and anything else you can think of. But these are simply crutches or band-aids that help us address a specific moment or situation. None of those are going to lead to long-term self-regulation. But we do know that co-regulated interactions within meaningful trusted relationships do lead to long-term self-regulation. So the question is, what type of environment should we be creating to both nurture a child's neuropotential while also respecting their neurodiversity? Each of the components defining neuropotential, including neuroplasticity, child development, and epigenetics, can be found within these studies, as well as many others. For more information, lectures, virtual coaching, video submissions with feedback, please go to stanleygreenspan.com. For in-person programs and intensives, please contact the Floortime Center.